all relationships are really based on one important thing, and that is this idea of an emotional attachment bond, right? All relationships are all about this sense of emotional connection that we have with another human being. In fact, the famous psychologist Sue Johnson talked about, the idea that human beings, rather than being, Homo sapiens, or the one who thinks, we're really kind of homo vinculum, which is the one who bonds, right? Humans bond with other people, and those emotional bonds are absolutely critical to our own self-development and our ability to form families and communities and all of that. And it is those bonds that we form with other people that become a really important component of our lives as we navigate through time, as we go through time and we age. And these emotional bonds really start in childhood. When a child is born, they are born in a very vulnerable state, and they need parents to be involved with them in order for them to survive. Because human beings, unlike a lot of other creatures who have the benefit of instinct to direct a lot of their behavior and allow them to navigate through life, human beings need to learn all of that from the adults around them while we're growing up. And so these emotional connections have been play a critical role, not only in keeping human beings close to each other and responsive to each other, but they are also important in how we develop our sense of self. And so when a child comes into the world, they're not a complete blank slate. Kids come out with a little bit of like a temperament. Some are more extroverted, some are more introverted, some are more adventurous, some are a little bit more reserved, just kind of by nature. But there is a large part of our sense of self that is just kind of like a blank slate. And we have essentially 5 needs, emotional needs that we develop through our relationships with our parents and the other caregivers around us. And so these are things like a need for a sense of identity, right? A need for a sense of connection, a need for a sense of security, a need for a sense of value, and a need for a sense of agency, right? And we will talk about each of those 5 in a little bit more detail in a moment. But when a child doesn't get those things from their parents, either because their parents are just non-responsive or don't know how to be present with their kids in a healthy way, or there's some addiction or broken families, or there's some other stuff going on, there are parts of us that may not develop very well. And so when we come into adulthood, oftentimes we can bring with us this kind of innate sense of that I'm not worthy, or I'm not valued, or I'm not important, or that I'm alone, or I'm isolated, or I can't trust people, and the world is a scary place, or I'm not sure who I am. This sense of there's a lot of things I'm interested in, but I don't have a kind of a clear sense of identity or who I am, or these feelings of helplessness, or like no matter what I try, nothing ever works out, or that I just can never really seem to accomplish anything. Right? When we grow up in families where some of these 5 emotional needs are not met, then we can come into adulthood with some sensitivities. And those sensitivities tend to show up in our relationships as adults. Because it turns out that not only do we have these emotional bonds and attachment relationships in childhood, but when we get into adulthood, we also form these same emotional bonds with our partners. And some of the, I'm going to use the word problems, but some of the things that we didn't get in childhood create some sensitivities that tend to show up, or some emotional reactivity that tends to show up within our adult relationships. Now, one of the differences between the bonds that we have, emotional bonds that we have as children versus adults, is that in a situation with parents and children are in a very dependent state, right? So they are always looking for the parent to be the provider. They are looking for the parent to be the caregiver. They're looking for the parent to give them some sense of direction and how to navigate through the world and be the problem solver and be the advocate and be the nurturing one, right? And when we get into adulthood and we go through that whole adolescent phase where, those parent-child bonds are broken down, and we go through the rebellious years and, shut up, mom, you don't know anything kind of stuff, right? Then we get into adulthood, and instead of having those dependent bonds where one partner is always dependent on the other, if all goes well, we form interdependent bonds where, each partner can be supportive or be supported, be the nurturer and caregiver, or be the one receiving that, where those roles can go back and forth. And that each of those 5 needs, right, that need for a sense of identity and connection and value and safety and agency, can be provided by both partners, right, for each other. They can give those things to each other. And that emotional bond between partners is so critical that any difficulty in a relationship, any conflict, any pattern of behavior where there's frustration or angst within the relationship can really be understood as some kind of stress in that attachment relationship. Right? So stated in another way, that any conflict that you are having, any problem that you are having in your relationship, it really comes down to something in that attachment bond. There's something that is going on that is causing that emotional attachment to be strained in some way. And when that happens, it will cause either partner to react, or both partners to react in a couple of fairly predictable ways. One is that we tend to be triggered by the very things that we didn't get in childhood. So if we grew up with a low sense of value, then when we have some difficulties in our adult relationships, we will tend to be really, really sensitive to any kind of signal from our partner that we are not valued, like they don't hear us. Whenever we try to approach them, it's like we don't matter, we're not here. So we'll tend to be very, very sensitive, and that tends to kind of organize the way in which conflict unfolds in the relationship.